So the Retina MacBook Air has been out for about over a month now, and I've seen a lot of takes on this Retina Ultrabook. Some positive takes, some negative takes, but how do I feel about using the MacBook Air after 1 month? So for my review, I got the absolute base model. I wanted to kind of go in with the budget-minded perspective because I think a lot of people who are purchasing a MacBook Air are the types of people who are going to be a little bit more price conscious than people who are purchasing a MacBook Pro. So I have the 128 gigabytes of storage and the 8 gigabytes of RAM. And I'm actually surprised how well the 8 gigabytes of RAM did on this MacBook Air, and also in the Mac Mini that I got. I also got that with only 8 gigabytes of RAM. And I've had tons of applications open at the same time, and I've never really had any slowdowns. I think it's because the SSDs inside of these modern Macs are so fast. So when you're using a computer and the RAM runs out, what they do is a virtual memory swap, so it'll borrow some of the space from the hard drive to store some of that random access memory. So even if I'm using a bunch of applications and I'm going over that 8 gigabyte RAM limit, I'm just not noticing it as much as I used to in older machines. And I haven't used a Mac with 8 gigabytes of RAM in a while. The iMac behind me has 40 gigabytes of RAM, and my MacBook Pro that I use has 16 gigabytes of RAM. So I'm actually very pleased with the performance with the 8 gigabytes of RAM. What I'm not pleased with is the 128 gigabytes of solid state storage. The 128 gigabytes is just a little bit too low for my use cases. I wanted to see if I could personally get by with it, but I'm just finding that it's not enough storage for me. I loaded a few apps and a few light games on there, and I had enough space to do that, but when I want to go edit photos or videos, that's where I'm running into a space constraint, and I just don't have enough storage to comfortably run on my MacBook Air. If anything, I'd recommend upgrading the solid state storage before upgrading your RAM. I think it's a more important upgrade. For most people, I recommend taking the 128 gigabytes and upgrading that to 256. So I mentioned this in my previous videos about the new Retina MacBook Air, but I really appreciate how much of a MacBook Air this is. When I first heard the rumors about a refresh to the MacBook Air and adding a Retina screen, I really thought they would just take the 13-inch MacBook Pro, put the Air name under it, and say, hey, here's your new MacBook Air. But they actually made a brand new design for it, and it's not a drastic design. It very much looks like an older MacBook Air, but just kind of shrunken down with a smaller footprint, a lower volume overall. But it still has that classic MacBook Air tapered edge design where it starts out thicker, and then as it goes along the MacBook Air, it just gets thinner and thinner. It's actually a little funny because the thickest part of the MacBook Air is actually thicker than the MacBook Pro, but as you run along the sides of it and as you get more towards the front of the screen, that's when it starts to get really thin. And because it's thinner, because it has a more modern design, Apple put 2 Thunderbolt 3 USB-C ports on it, so you can use that for charging and connecting additional accessories, and these are the most powerful ports that you can currently get on a laptop. And a lot of Windows laptops have been inconsistent with the Thunderbolt 3 spec. A lot of them just add the USB-C part. So I really do appreciate that on Apple's modern laptops, they only add Thunderbolt 3 ports, so it doesn't confuse you. If you plug in an eGPU to any of these ports, it's going to work. And the same for any accessory like a 4K or 5K external display. Anything you plug into that device is just going to work. Now, this Retina MacBook Air weighs a little bit less than the current 13-inch MacBook Pros. It weighs 2.75 pounds. I've seen a lot of reviews say that this weight difference doesn't really make too much of a difference, and I kinda tend to disagree. At first glance, at first blush, when you pick it up, maybe it's not going to make a difference, but when you're carrying a bunch of stuff in your bag all day, or if you're carrying this laptop in your hand as you're walking around the house and doing things, after a while, that little bit of weight does make a difference for me. The air vents on this is also another thing that I think a lot of reviewers don't talk about, and that is that the MacBook Air doesn't have any air vents on the bottom of the device. So if you compare that to the current generation of MacBook Pros, when you pick up the device, you'll get those air vents digging into your fingers. If you put it on your lap, sometimes that can pinch into your lap a little bit more. And they are vents with fans blowing, so when you're using the MacBook Pros, having those vents on the bottom, it's blowing hot air into your lap. And it's the little details like that that make using the MacBook Air a little more comfortable, and I barely see reviewers mention these little tiny details. Of course, the highlight feature on the 2018 MacBook Air is the inclusion of a 13.3 Retina screen with a resolution of 2560 by 1600. After a month of use, and especially comparing it to the older MacBook Air, it's really hard not to appreciate the screen improvement on it. Text is sharp, color is really nice for watching video. One of the things I mentioned in my initial review, that the screen only got up to 300 nits of brightness compared to the 500 nits offered by the MacBook Pro. I've seen a lot of people mention online that the lower brightness in the MacBook Air bothered them. For me, it hasn't been too much of an issue. I might have it towards the more brighter setting, but that is plenty bright for my use case. But if you tend to use your laptop in direct sunlight, that might be a bigger issue for you. My only complaint after using this for a month is the lack of P3 wide color gamut support. So you miss out on the wide color spectrum that P3 offers, and in day-to-day use, it's noticeable. And that's because all of my other Apple devices support the P3 wide color gamut. So as I'm jumping between multiple devices, my iMac, my iPad Pro, my iPhone, and then I go back to that MacBook Air, I start to notice that the screen doesn't offer the wider variety of colors. However, if you're coming from an older computer, especially an older MacBook Air, this isn't going to be a big issue for you at all. You're probably not even going to notice it. And if you're coming from an old MacBook Air with that old screen, you're going to really love this screen. Okay, I think another controversial thing and another thing you guys are probably wondering about is how does the keyboard feel after 1 month of use? Because these keyboards are very polarizing, especially for the key travel and of course the reliability issues that previous generations of the MacBook Pro and MacBook have had. Now this is the 3rd generation butterfly keyboard, which supposedly fixed some of the problems with the debris entering the keyboard. After 1 month of use, I haven't had any stuck keys, but that's a little too short even to get a damaged key on the older versions, so we're gonna have to wait a little bit longer. But the only thing I can tell you is that the MacBook Pros have been on the market a little bit longer, and so far I haven't seen any widespread kind of damage going on with those keyboards. But if anything does happen to my keyboard in the coming months, I will be sure to let everyone know. As for the keys themselves, I have said before on this channel that I do like the shallow key travel on the new 3rd generation MacBook Air keyboard. I find the keys to be really precise, I find the keyboard to be really good, and when I go back to an older MacBook Air or an older MacBook Pro and they have that old keyboard style, I think the keys are way too mushy and I don't like the feeling of them. I think for a lot of people, you just got to give it about a week of use to see if these keyboards really work for you. If you go into the Apple store and you use them for like 5 minutes and then you go, I don't like these keyboards, maybe it's just because they feel different. And I'm not saying you're wrong. I know a lot of people don't like these keyboards, but I would recommend trying them out for at least a week, and then if you don't like them, maybe you can return it to the Apple Store. Now, the biggest change to this keyboard is, of course, the inclusion of Touch ID in the top right portion of the keyboard. Now, while I like Touch ID and I'd rather have it than having no option, I am a little bit annoyed that, say, when you restart your MacBook Air, you can't log in using the Touch ID sensor. You have to enter in your password whenever you do a hard restart. I do find it much more useful for third-party apps, or when you're entering a password into a website, you can just quickly tap the Touch ID into the right corner to log you in. But at this point, after seeing what Face ID can do on the iPad Pro, I really miss it on the MacBooks. I really hope that next generation Apple moves away from Touch ID on their laptop lines and includes a Face ID sensor. That would be a benefit to me because I wear an Apple Watch, and one of the features when you wear an Apple Watch is you can have it unlock your Mac for you. So a lot of the time when I go to open up my MacBook Air, if I have the Apple Watch unlock feature enabled, I can't even reach to the fingerprint sensor because my Apple Watch has already unlocked the computer. So I think one of the last things to cover after a month of using this is the performance of the MacBook Air. And again, like everything else I mentioned in this video, this was also faced with a big controversy when it was first released. So Apple isn't using the most powerful chips in this MacBook Air laptop line. They're using a Core i5 dual-core processor, which is apparently a Y-core processor. So these are underpowered chips, and they're usually powered at 5 watts, but apparently on the new MacBook Airs, they're powered at 7.5 watts. And recently I read an article somewhere where someone mentioned that the MacBook Air was a disappointing and boring computer because it included these chips and didn't offer the option to go to an i5 or an i7 model. And they specifically pointed to the Google Pixel Slate as being better than this MacBook Air because it offered a Core i7 processor as an option. And I laughed to myself at this article because if you've been keeping up with the Google Pixel Slate and if you've been looking at the reviews, you know the performance on that machine is really unoptimized, really slow, really laggy. And it's just that classic thing of you can't really base a computer based on the spec sheet alone, especially if you have really good optimized software and other factors going into it. It's fine for those everyday tasks like browsing the web, watching movies, listening to music, maybe even doing a few more powerful features like doing some light photo editing, editing some 1080p video, maybe even some 4K video in Final Cut Pro. As long as you're not expecting top level performance, as long as you know that you're an average consumer, you're going to be using this thing mostly for browsing the web, mostly for carrying around with you, maybe doing some word processing, all these little different tasks. And maybe if you want to delve into doing video editing, maybe you want to delve into doing some music production or photo editing, this machine should be able to carry out the basic parts of those tasks that most consumers would be doing. And yes, you might be asking, why didn't they just throw a quad-core processor, the same one that's found in the MacBook Pros? There are advantages to having a lower powered chip in the MacBook Air. So the first benefit for me has definitely been battery life. I've been getting longer battery life on the MacBook Air than any of my MacBook Pros, the 13 or 15-inch versions. I get anywhere around 10 to 12 hours of daily use using my MacBook Air. I also noticed the noise profile, especially the fans in the MacBook Air when doing basic tasks, is much lower than when I'm using my MacBook Pro. So if you don't want loud fans constantly whirling up and sounding like a jet engine, then maybe you'll gravitate more towards the MacBook Air. And because it's using that lower powered chip, I've also found that it hasn't been getting as hot when I'm using it on my lap. And if you watch my MacBook Pro review, you know that was my #1 complaint with it, is that sometimes it got way too hot, especially when it was on my lap. And I haven't had that issue at all, even using this MacBook Air for a full month now. I've never felt that it was too hot to be using on my lap. Now, if you're a pro sitting here watching this review and you were considering the MacBook Air, you're someone who needs to edit a lot of 4K video, you're someone who needs to do batch processing in your photo applications, you're someone who needs to compile code at ridiculous speeds, this MacBook Air isn't for you. MacBook Air is a great laptop, especially a great laptop for people who want a light laptop with great battery life, good enough performance, and software optimization, and a laptop that runs Mac OS. It's a great laptop for everyday tasks, and if you don't need that raw power, you know who you are, it is a really solid laptop. But that being said, here's the part where I, as a reviewer, have to be honest with you. I've had a month to use this machine, and this product doesn't live in a vacuum. There are other products out there, and most notably is the new iPad Pro. And as I've had both of these devices, they kind of fill out the same tasks that I would use them for, and I've been gravitating a lot more towards the 11-inch iPad Pro. The crazy thing to me about all this is the iPad Pro is cheaper than the MacBook Air, at least when you don't factor in the keyboard and the Apple Pencil. The new iPad Pro is also more powerful than the 2018 MacBook Pro. The performance on it is more than double, and it's completely fanless, so what I really want from a future version of the MacBook Air is for Apple to finally include its own chips inside of it. I really want to see Apple include an A12X chip or the A13X or whatever the chips they're going to be called that they're putting into their Mac line to finally make its way to the MacBook Air. I think it could be a much better device if Apple just did that. Now, if you're asking me what do I recommend most people buy, if they should buy the iPad Pro or if they should go out and buy this 2018 Retina MacBook Air, I think that really boils down to if you want the iOS experience or if you want the Mac OS experience. As for a thin and light device, I gravitate more towards the iPad Pro, but maybe that's not your use case. Maybe you need to run classic Mac OS applications. Maybe you like the way laptops work better. Maybe you like the typing experience better on it. Maybe you just like something that the MacBook Air offers that the iPad Pro could never offer you. So if the iPad Pro doesn't work for you and you want a classic Mac OS experience, you want a classic laptop experience, I do think the Retina MacBook Air is a really good choice. Just don't buy it expecting any crazy level of performance out of it. Okay, everyone, and that's been my experience of using the MacBook Air for 1 month now. Let me know what you think of the video. If you guys liked it, make sure you give me a like. If you want to see more from my channel, make sure you guys are subscribed. Also, let me know in the comments below. Do you own the new MacBook Air? How are you liking it? If you have an iPad Pro, are you gravitating more towards that? Or if you're in the market for both of them, which way are you leaning? If you want to support the channel, make sure you check out the links in the description. I'll have an affiliate link to the MacBook Air, and I'll also have a link to my merch store where you can buy some pretty cool merchandise. And as always, I will see you all in the next video. Take care, everyone.